at a penultimate session of Friday, and also that means by default our penultimate academic session of Yerevan. How quickly that has flown by. But without further ado, I want to give over the floor to Professor Dominic Lieven, who will be talking about reflections on a life in the Russian and Imperial history. And again, Professor Lieven is going to talk for about sort of 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll have a fantastic Q&A as we did last time. So Professor Lieven, over to you.
Thank you. I'm a little embarrassed by the comment that this is the penultimate academic session. As I wrote this piece last night, it did attempt to have academic elements combined with anecdotes and various other bits of autobiography. Having listened to all this morning and having wickedly appropriated part of Sheila and Ron's session to let off my geopolitical fantasies, I'm afraid I am about to lower the tone, but here goes anyway. Good. I belong to a different era, from a different background. This is just going to be off the map for most of you, and it's going to sound politically incorrect on such an appalling scale that, you know, I dread to think what's going to happen next. But anyway, all right. As I said yesterday, I became a historian above all, I think, because when I was a child and a young adolescent, I was told all these extraordinary stories by elderly relatives. And they just inspired my imagination. Doesn't mean I, don't also believe that history is essential for understanding the present and is some help to, finding a path into the future. But if I was honest, that isn't why I personally became a historian. What you will, some of you, be more aware of, given that your interest in Russian affairs, is the, in inverted commas, Russian side of my background, but it was actually my mother's Imperial background, which dominated our childhood and adolescence. The Russian element was there on the side, but it was what you might describe the British Imperial and Catholic values of my mother's family, which played a more central role. They all disintegrated in the late 60s and early 70s. Because of the social, cultural, sexual, whatever you want to name it, revolution of the 60s, and into the very large void which there then existed, to some extent marched Imperial Russia, the world of my father's family, to which I've been, dedicating much of the last 45 years of my life, 50 years. It wasn't inevitable. They tried to bring us up as little English gentlemen and ladies. It didn't work. None of my siblings ended up like that. We exploded in different directions, so that my elder sister became a hereditary communist. My elder brother sort of disappeared, often became a postman for 10 years. You'll meet my younger brother, who's turning up tomorrow. My younger sister is the only one of us who's firmly English, and she's far younger than I am. She's a very ferocious High Court judge. So, everything went everywhere. My mother's family was what used to be called Castle Catholic. In other words, it was really the first generation. Her great-granddad was the first Catholic Chief Justice of Ireland after emancipation, the first for centuries, Her dad was a senior British official in India. They were very Catholic. Most of them were pro the British Crown, but they were not English. So it was a bit equivocal. The great teller of stories about that was my grandma, my mother's mother, who I adored, and had a flat in our house. It was a splendid character and told me endless stories about aspects of India. She was both born in British India, lived as a child for a time in British India, married, was sent home in inverted commas, as children were. Above all, better education, no diseases, but then went back to India, married in India, lived in India, etc., the husband. And certainly it was British India, which was the most exciting time of her life, along with the world wars and two other things. She was great. She really got me interested in British India, but I was a rather kind of excitable and nervous child. So her idea of a good bedtime story was a man-eating tigers of this and man-eating leopard of something else, which had a fatal effect on me. I lived on the top 5th floor of our house in London, went to sleep every night with 3 cricket balls, 2 knives, a torch, and a compass, for God's sake, in case a man-eating tiger came to eat me. The compass being in case the man-eating tiger dragged me off to Kensington Gardens but forgot to eat me and I had to get my way home. I mean, well, I also barricaded my door against the tiger. And once I had one of my recurring nightmares and was howling about the tiger. My nanny tried to come in and rescue me. The barricade fell on her head. I began hurling cricket balls at her, and she didn't talk to my grandma for a week. Anyway, in time, of course, things got a bit more adult. I remember I can't have been much more than 10. My grandma, after school in actually Scotland, was sent off to finishing school, as was done with sort of girls of respectable background in those days in Dresden. And she told me, so I don't know why it stuck in my memory. She said that, you know, if you were going out, of course, very respectably with a young officer and there was no empty table at the restaurant cafe, a civilian automatically gave up his place to you. And that had really shocked her because you didn't get that in British India, or indeed, of course, in Britain. Her best friend married a very polite, she said, my grandma said, very nice young lieutenant, who later became General Field Marshal von Witzleben. If the July plot had succeeded, he would have been the German head of state, certainly the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Instead, it didn't succeed, and he was murdered by Hitler's gang. I think I genuinely got to about the age of 15, 16, 17. As was sometimes the case in our family, it was the silences which were most interesting and resonated most. My grandma's father was a character called Pringle Kennedy. He was my only genuinely middle-class great-grandfather, was a very successful barrister in British India. Actually, rather a good amateur historian, and one of the first members of what became the Indian Congress Party. For a man of that background, he showed the great courage in the 1890s, after the death of his first wife, my great-grandma, he married an Indian woman. That would have been something much easier to do a century before. His Indian wife and my grandmother's twin sister by the first marriage were assassinated in 1908 by Indian nationalist revolutionaries. It's a very, very famous case in Indian history because they are said to be the only white women, or British women, to be killed between the mutiny and the end of the Raj. Of course, it was an accident. They mistook, these revolutionaries for a bomb mistook their carriage for that of a very and rightly unpopular British official. What is really fascinating is that neither in the British nor in the Indian historiography of this very famous case is it ever mentioned that one of the two women was actually Indian. It's quite interesting to ask why neither side said this, you know. The Bose brothers, Subhash Chandra Bose's great nephews, great friends of mine, one at Harvard, one at LSE. I've quite often gone out to talk for them in Calcutta. I remember the first time I went out to give the keynote lecture at the Bose weekend, because the Boses are the biggest political dynasty in Bengal. The governor of Bengal, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, was an absolutely sweet character. After I told this story in my lecture, he came up to me and put his hands around mine and said, "Dear Professor Lieven, I think India owes you an apology." Of course, it didn't owe me an apology. But what was also interesting and sad, but again, you know, only one of the children of the second marriage, you know, in other words, my grandmother's half-sister, Aunt Marjorie, lived. I loved her. I got to know her very well. She came to stay with us. She was a great old character. But none of us ever dared ask her about what the impact on her life, either of the assassination or of actually being very obviously, you know, half non-white was in a deeply racist world. It was clear that it was easier to be that in respectable British circles in the UK than in the British colonies. That we did get out of her. Our mother said we mustn't ask. It was simply all too painful. I could go on, but won't. I shall talk about my father's side instead, which in some ways is more relevant to you lot. The equivalent of my grandmother on my mother's side was my great-aunt Alexandra, Alika, who lived in London. She actually was with the Russian army in Persia, rode over the Khyber Pass in India, married a British grandee there, came back to England, was the only one of us who had lots of pots of money, had no children, and so we were her honorary children, really, or grandchildren. And I remember about the age of 6 or 7, I went to have tea with her on my own. I was rather persona grata because I was already showing signs of interest in that world. And she said that when she was 6, she'd gone to have tea with her godmother. who was the daughter of a man called Count Karl Nesselrode, who was the Russian foreign minister and chancellor for a long time, from about 1819 to until after the Crimean War. And her godmother told her that when she had been aged 6, she'd gone to bed, as always, in their sort of grand apartments in the embassy in Paris, because Nesselrode was number 2 in the embassy in Paris, the Russian embassy, and also the head of the Russian espionage operation against Napoleon, exceptionally successful espionage operation. She'd gone to bed as normal, and then she was woken up 3 hours later, put into her best nightgown, her hair very carefully brushed by her governess, and then her mother came to collect her, and unusually for a child, she was taken down the great formal staircase of the embassy into the reception rooms to make her curtsy to the Emperor Napoleon, who was visiting the embassy. Well, even at the age of 6, my little ears went like that, you know. I'm talking to someone who at the age of 6 talked to the Emperor Napoleon. Aunt Alika was quite something. She was not an easy person to be around with, particularly if they were trying to bring you up as a polite little sort of English boy. Reticent she was not. Well, one of the things about being a nurse in Persia, for her it was liberation, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. She had this, well, you can judge, she had a difficult mother, as you might say. When she was in Persia as a nurse, she fell in love with the yaks, whom the Russian army used for transport purposes. She adored them. She was put in charge of them. And she remained convinced to her death that they spoke Russian and had a particular affinity for her. So we would go down to London Zoo as small children, this size, I was the smallest, to feed the yaks and talk Russian to them. Whether the yaks spoke Russian or not, they sure as hell knew it was the best meal they're going to get in a month. Because my great-aunt Alika this was feudal, she had this awful flunky, whom she sent off to get boxes of chocolate eclairs and meringues and millefeuille and those wonderfully polite sandwiches which English clergymen made for Sunday, you know, if they were Sunday sort of whatever teas, Jesus, to feed the yaks, not to feed us. God forbid you didn't spoil children in England in those days, to feed the yaks. At the word of command, we would open the boxes and volley chocolate eclairs, meringues, the whole lot over the fence to the yaks, who of course went mad with excitement. I was terrified. These are huge, you know, creatures. She'd married this ultra-English grandee, so none of the keepers dared stop her. Of course, it was strictly illegal even in those days. God only knows what the effect on the yak stomachs was. But anyway, you know, this really got my imagination going. You know, England in the 1950s was okay, but it was a bit boring. You know, English cows were 3 times smaller than Russian cows. I took this as being the average Russian cow, a yak. Well, it was 3 times bigger than an English cow. It was very furry. And unlike English boring cows which ate grass, Russian cows ate chocolate eclairs, meringues and millefeuille. So, of course, I had this extraordinary vision of Russian in those days. Anyway, to understand Aunt Alika, you had, well, as I say, she escaped from her mother. The war, as for a number of women from that sort of background, was liberation. My great-grandmother was a Fontepalan and had got religion in a serious way. She was an evangelical. She'd been evangelized by this wretched English peer who turned up. She and her sister, who married Sergei Gagarin, lived at 43 and 45 Bolshaya Morskaya in central Petersburg. On the corner of St. Isaac's Square, the next house is the old German embassy. And my great-grandma was the widow of my great-grandfather, had been the Lord Chamberlain of the Imperial Court. She refused to let her daughters be presented at court because she said that was where nice girls got VD. And she basically locked them up. Now, last time I was in Russia in 2019, I wasn't there for that purpose. I was donating my books to a library and crafty things. Anyway, but I was kidnapped, essentially, very kindly kidnapped, by the Russian evangelicals who stage an annual do and were staging a particularly annual do in honor of my great-grandma, who they literally, and great-aunt Vera Gagarin, who they regarded as saints. You literally got people coming up and touching me, you know, it was slightly weird. And I had to be, you know, it is the only, well, they staged some of these great festivities in our old palazzos in 43, 45 Bolshaya Morskaya. But the final version was so big they had to hire out Vita's Technological Institute. So it happened by ill fate to be my birthday, which they've discovered. So I've never, ever had 3,000 people springing to their feet and singing happy birthday in Russian. So, yeah, it was all great. And they went on about, you know, what a wonderful philanthropist she was. And she had turned the sort of palazzo, whatever you want to call it, into a vast workshop for women to keep them out of prostitution. She did do all sorts of things, but she was also an utter domestic tyrant. You know, you combine aristocratic arrogance with the arrogance of relatively actually simple people who think evangelical, who think that God is speaking through their mouths, and you get a pretty powerful mixture. You know, Aunt Alika finally escaped to Persia as a nurse. Her elder sister fled, she just couldn't cope, fled off to Switzerland to become a nurse in a children's hospital. The children's hospital burnt down, and she very honourably sacrificed her life to rescue the children. She'd left all her money behind, but she didn't, you know, anyway, but that's what she did. It took a very, very painful month to die, and my great-grandma refused to go and visit her because she said she was a disobedient daughter. I mean, you get something of the spirit. She married my great-grandfather, who was twice her age, simply because he had a very large fortune and no heir. He was the Lord Chamberlain. He was, you know, the marshal, the senior representative of the Baltic German nobility for years, but also the Lord Chamberlain of the Imperial court. You know, he was right at the heart of the old aristocracy. He also... well, he was not just probably the richest landowner in Livonia and Courland, but he also had estates in Russia. But he also owned the core of what is now called Donetsk, the mines, the town. He let it, then finally his widow sold it 50 years later to a horrid Welshman called Hughes, who developed it, which is why it was called Hughesovka before the revolution. So as you might say politely, he was not poor. He was the only son and the heir. The trouble was, he loved Rome, and in one of his early expeditions in Rome, he'd fallen in love with this Roman principessa from one of the grand old families. The trouble is, as fate would have it, she'd been married off at the age of 15 to a cousin. The cousin inevitably was not interested in women, but the scandal of a divorce and, you know, admitting that he was a homosexual was just not to be borne. So they had a wonderful love affair for 30 years, but, you know, since the prince refused to die, you know, the issue came up. So he was forced to marry this second cousin, half his age. When I was an adolescent, or child and adolescent, there was this Italian principessa floating round in the ambience, particularly of my uncle and aunt, and we were told it was an old family friend. It was only when I reached a respectable age it was explained she was our illegitimate second cousin. Because the old principe was, you know, the aristocratic world in those days was a sort of funny mixture by modern standards. No overt scandal, but nobody gave a damn usually about these kind of relationships. So he cheerfully accepted their children as his own. But of course nothing could be made public. So anyway, it got more and more exciting. Again, interesting, my great-grandfather's sister Marie also fled the coup, but she fled to London, where she became part of the Marx and Herzen circle, particularly the Marx circle because German was she was a Baltic German lady. She paid for a lot of the revolutionary exiles from Germany in 1848 to 9, to go off to America, including a character called Carl Schurz, who later became a US senator. Bloody awful Union general in the Civil War, but quite a good senator, etc., 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 etc. It was rather amusing because she set up this sort of radical socialist salon in London in about 45, 46, I think. And only 10, 15 years before, her aunt, Dorothea Lieven, had been the Russian ambassadress for 22 years, in other words, the wife of the ambassador. But, you know, and had an extremely conservative salon there. My aunt, great-aunt Dorothea, was also no slouch, though not necessarily, well, she would be regarded by most people as politically very objectionable. She was the mistress of Metternich, which was not a secret to the Russian emperor, because the Russian emperor was, well, her mother-in-law, my great-great-great, had been the adored governess and second mother of the imperial children. So Nicholas knew exactly what was going on. So the Russian government used her as a source of disinformation to Metternich, feeding information to Metternich, which did wonders for Russian foreign policy, but not so much for the relationship. So she ditched him and ran off with the French prime minister instead. I mean, these would, you know, look, I was a very, very discombobulated adolescent. I did very well academically in Cambridge, but I thought I'd go completely mad if I went on. So I went into that, I threw up academia completely and went into that wonderfully sane institution, the British Foreign Office. But as you might imagine, you know, after tales of being Metternich's mistress and Guizot and all the other diplomats in the family, room 133 West and being the little desk officer for Sri Lanka, was not very inspiring. And also, I was a catastrophic diplomat, quite apart from not being British. Within literally 2 weeks of being on the job, I had sent a letter direct to the Queen, which was contrary to every kind of protocol. Letters to the Queen in the British Foreign Office go up, you know, Your Britannic Majesty's Principal Secretary of State, you know, humbly begs on all fours, bending backwards, you know, to present to Your Holiness this and that. And all the piece of paper is sewn together with blue thread. Amazing stuff. So that wasn't very good. I also turned out an RAF Guard of Honour an hour early in rural Oxfordshire because no one had explained to me that the RAF was operating on a different timescale. My great buddy was in the office was Matthew Paris, who some of the English people may know. We competed for tactlessness. I was the first, he was the second. The Foreign Office was relieved but a bit sad to see the back of Matthew. They were just relieved to see the back of me. Anyway, off we go. The person, I mean, this was all part of the family law. And once, of course, you began talking the old relatives, it all poured down on you. And anyway, there's a vast published literature on this. I mean, in the immediate sense, probably for my career, it was my father's elder brother, Leo, was far more conservative than my father, who was a source of both, you know, imagination and then some genuine guidance. Also, when I was about 8, Leo, who was a colonel in the British Army, got this little medal, and he insisted on taking me off to Buckingham Palace. Not the Queen, not his wife, not anyone else, just little me, aged 8. No one could understand it. It was only my father fed him some whiskey and finally got out of the fact that when he was 8, he'd met poor Nicholas II. And as he put it, I must go off and meet Elizabeth II. He had a wonderfully gloomy Scandinavian accent, in case the same happened. In other words, in case the poor Queen got bumped off too, as a be a memory. Actually, the story, I mean, he told endless stories, but the one which really, again, stuck in my imagination was the one about the time when his father was locked up in... My grandfather's big estate was in rural Livonia, but there was a small town on the estate. It was a big estate. And rural Latvia in September 1917 was very radical. So the local Soviet, mostly Latvian Latvian basically, locked him up in the estate steward's house and was going to shoot him the next morning. And my uncle and aunt, aged 8 and 7, were locked in the nursery on the top floor, of course, terrified. They knew their father was going to be murdered in the morning. The officers of the local Russian regiment, which was the Siberian regiment, tried to rescue him. The men were not hostile, they were just all drunk. And so things were looking pretty grim at about 2 in the morning when this bloody great noise came up the hill. The manor house is on top of a hill. And this was the local Jewish community headed by their rabbi, who stormed the hill, scared the living shits out of the Latvians and rescued my granddad. Now, this really resonated for me because, you know, the white Russian emigration was not known for its, you know, good relations with the Jews. I mean, some of my relatives were terrible anti-Semites. Not my immediate ones, I have to say. My granddad was the opposite. He always said that of all the people he'd ever been kind to, the Jews had repaid him most completely. The thing is, before the revolution, he genuinely did. I went there. He built hospitals and orphanages and he built a power station. He built all sorts of things for the people on the estates. He also subsidized the building of churches, so he insisted on also subsidizing the building of synagogues. And he also insisted that the Jews should have equal access to all his private. No one could stop him. This was his private property. They should have exactly equal access to the schools and everything else. So they rescued him. And I must say, later in London, the best... Actually, they're all wonderful stories. I can't tell them all about the family's relationship with the local Jewish community were told me by my uncle and aunt's great friend, Manny Herbert, whose family had run the main shop on the main estate, his elder brother Anatol's estate, in southern Latvia. Manny was a great character. He was a very, very good doctor in Harley Street. It was in his surgery that the first steps in the Israeli-Jordanian peace process began, because both King Hussein and Golda Meir were his patients. Everybody trusted Manny. But he told wonderful stories about, both on the estates and everything. He was, apart from, he was Jewish, for God's sake, but he was in the Freikorps. And he said the Freikorps in his neck of the woods was nothing like what was normally said. He said Jews were regarded as honorary Germans. And no, he said it was a wonderfully civilized army. You could resign the first Monday of the month and no one minded. But he said, and this is totally counterintuitive again, that his great-uncle who ran the store and my great-uncle Anatole, the owner of the estate, were real buddies. And that isn't a likely story in the sense, obviously, they came from different worlds. My great-uncle Anatole was a caricature of the establishment, Svetleshi Knyaz, owner, of course, of the main estate, all went out, entail male primogeniture, lord-in-waiting, the whole bloody lot. He commanded the first squadron of the Chevalier Guard, the Noble Guard, the senior unit in the Guards cavalry. He won the St. George's Cross in 1915 for the last great cavalry attack of the Noble Guard. He commanded a brigade in Udenich's White Army in the Civil War. Yeah, this is literally on the... But no, man, he said, no, it didn't matter. But they got on. They're perfectly decent human beings. But above all, they both loved fishing. And most important of all, they had a common enemy. They were both terrified of their wives. And the point was there was this great big river which ran behind the big, this was actually a palazzo, it wasn't a manor house. And if you went on, there was an island in the middle of the river. Went on the other side of the island, you could really pretend you couldn't hear a damn thing. So these two men, terrified of their wives, used to go fishing on the other side of the island, and that built up a friendship. Okay, I mean, more seriously, actually, it was Leo who, at the age of my 13th birthday, he gave me the English translation of the famous memorandum to Nicholas II of the former Minister of Interior who'd squashed the 1905 revolution, to Pyotr Nikolaevich Donavo, warning Nicholas that there was no middle ground in Russia, that European war was coming, Russia wouldn't survive it, and there would be a full-scale socialist revolution. And you could, I suppose, at a pinch say that the first 10 years of my career, academic career, was following up both the domestic and foreign policy implications of that memorandum. Well, as you could imagine, when I arrived in the profession, in what was, I suppose, began my PhD in 1975, I was what you might describe as a slight oddball. My generation mostly studied Russian history because they liked the revolution and they were the 60s generation, and they were looking at the Soviet Union as a sort of alternative, better version of socialist modernity. And some of them, on the contrary, were liberals, and the older generation were defending Western liberalism, against communism. It was all tied up with the Cold War. Little Lieven sort of wandering in. Some of the battles, you wouldn't know anything about this, but there was a famous naval battle at the end of 1914 between the German Pacific Squadron under Count von Spee and the British. And this was a battle between modern, boom, 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 big modern sort of battle cruisers and things. Into the middle of this sailed a very, very innocent sailing ship, which didn't have a radio and wasn't even aware that there was a war on. And suddenly they were in the middle of this, boom, boom, boom. This was roughly me arriving in, Cold War ideological academic politics. Anyway, obviously and I studied the last generation of the old governing elite, strictly speaking, the members of the State Council. And off I went, of course, to the archives, which was wonderful. But I was, as you might say, something of a hot potato for the poor history department of Moscow State University, who had to find me a supervisor. Soviet propaganda was not always wrong. My father was exactly the caricature. He was, as I say, an émigré Svetleshi Knyaz. He was the nephew of a junior but not insignificant white general. He was a former officer of the British Intelligence Service, and he was the head, first directly and now indirectly, of broadcasting to the Soviet Union. By the time I got there, the whole communist world he was in charge of. The week I went into Moscow State University History Department for the first time was also the first time that Solzhenitsyn came to dinner at home in London. So I was a hot potato. And unsurprisingly, there was no great rush of members of the faculty to become my supervisor. Finally, I was assigned to this character called Chemensky, and of course there were terrible whispers that he was the most dreadful Stalinist, horrible whispers about how he denounced everybody to whatever. I have no idea whether this was true or it was academic bile. All I can say was that he treated me absolutely wonderfully. I arrived to see him the first time, very nervous. He said, "Look, what's going on? Your archives are mostly in Leningrad. They've sent you here." "Yes," I said, "I told them I wanted to go to Leningrad, so they sent me here." "Bloody fool," he said, and promptly gave me a 6-month commandirovka to Leningrad. I worked pretty hard. So I made myself unpopular with the archives. Every time I got thrown out, he got me in the next day. Bang. And sweetly, we were supposed to make a report to the faculty at the end of our year as stagiaire. And he said very sweetly to me, "I think in your case, you better make your report to me and I'll pass it on." And he gave me a glass of wine as well. So, it's an anecdote, but actually out of all that time working with, not working with, but being protected by Chemensky and talking to some of those old Soviet professors, the one lesson I learned was you keep politics out of academic research. And actually, when we start to academics, so I had lots of good professional relationships with them. And if I have one commitment at the moment, and it was what I was doing in the conference I've just come from, which I organised in Almaty, it is to the extent possible to preserve academic links and academic integrity in the midst of all the contemporary politics. Of course, working in the archives wasn't Chemensky, it was getting in there, and it was a business. We all went there on a government-to-government exchange. In principle, of course, we had the right to get into the archives. It was part of the treaty. But in those days, if you were a foreigner, you couldn't look at the opisi in the archive. Well, you can imagine getting into an archive and not being allowed to look at the index for millions of documents. The principle was that you could only look at documents which Soviet historians had already looked at. We were assigned сотрудники, much more often сотрудницы, who in principle, in theory, were there to help us, actually were there to watch us. Well, my сотрудница never broke the rules, but she regarded me as a sort of favourite, slightly goofy nephew, and more or less carried me around like a little dog in her shopping basket, and I'd look up every now and then. She never broke the rules. She didn't show me the opisi, but she did sit in corners of the archive and read them out aloud to me, with a commentary going along at the same time. Jesus, no, hurry up. She also sometimes ordered documents for me under her own name. So I would sometimes get 100 documents a day. The thing about Russia is it's such an anarchical place that sometimes rules designed to thwart you can work in your favour if the personal connections are right. And then in those days, I couldn't get into the military or diplomatic archives. I didn't need to. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, then I got into the military and diplomatic archives. And I do remember my grandmother's uncle was a character called General Count Keller, commanded a cavalry corps in February 1917. He was one of the very rare senior generals who responded to Alexeyev's famous inquiry about the abdication of Nicholas II. The great majority of the other generals said abdicate immediately. Old Keller sent back a telegram saying, "No abdication, we'll be here tomorrow, me and my lads will sort out all this stuff," you see. So he was regarded with a certain scepticism, to be honest, even by me. Slightly goofy type. Apart from this, he insisted on staying in Kiev when the Germans evacuated, and insisted on wearing his uniform as an aide-de-camp of the Empress, and not surprisingly, the Bolsheviks bumped him off. When I got into the military archive for the first time, the front hall, there is old great-uncle Goofy, and above is the inscription, "A true Russian Christian knight." I realised the world had gone completely crazy. To explain my very odd career, because I'm a historian who spent the overwhelming majority of his career in the politics department. I'm a historian who, became a historian because of enormous interest in the past, and yet I actually had a much more direct role in politics and policy than most historians ever do, and that can only be explained partly by autobiography and partly by the Cold War, and so I will. Look, I graduated first in my year in Cambridge. Well, normally in those days that guaranteed you a junior research fellowship. I didn't even get an interview. Well, there were all sorts of reasons for that, but undoubtedly the most important was that the person in charge was E.H. Carr, who some of you may have heard of, who was the absolute doyen of, left-wing history, pro-Soviet, you name it. So that was all a bit of a shock, though actually it was a salvation, because if I'd gone back to Cambridge, I would have been a corpse within 2 years. Anyway, 3 months later, I got a job at the LSE in a politics department. I'd never read a word of political science. I never believed it. I was even head of department for 3 years. I still didn't believe it. There were decent reasons for not getting the Cambridge job, though they were not the most important ones. There were decent reasons for getting the LSE job, though they were certainly not the most important ones. The key to it was the Cold War. LSE Russian Studies was Leonard Shapiro and Peter Redoway. They, on the contrary, were on the right. They didn't know about my personal history with Carr, but Leonard Shapiro hated Carr, both for political reasons and because, probably rightly, he thought Carr had blocked the publication of his book, The Origins of the Soviet Autocracy. But the sort of shocking moment for me was that the head of department at the time was Elie Keduri, and he was on the appointment committee. So when I was appointed, about a week later, Elie invited me to lunch. And at the end, towards the end of the lunch, he said, "We don't mind what you think," by which I think he meant that, given my background, he thought I might be some dreadful anti-Semite, or whatever else I had been in my life. That I never was. "We don't care what you think," he said, "just as long as you hate E.H. Carr as much as we do." And he had no idea of this gives you something of the reality, of appointments at that time. Well, sitting in a politics department for 31 years, as I never was a political scientist, but of course it did influence me. It certainly helps to explain, along with another autobiographical detail, which I'll mention if I have time, it turned me towards comparative history. What you've got to remember is that for 31 years, all this business of the cultural turn completely left me beside. It had nothing to do with me. I was fighting the rational choices in political science. When I finally began turning up for history seminars and these cultural history types began talking, I literally couldn't understand what they were saying. They would talk and they'd have all these long words which seemed to be German written backwards. And all I could do was smile and make the sign of the cross. I hadn't got a clue what they were talking about. They disappeared off into some strange language. But the other exciting thing about being in a politics department is that my supervisor, Hugh Seaton-Watson, and Leonard Shapiro created Margaret Thatcher as the Iron Maiden. Everything she knew or thought she knew about the Soviet Union and communism, they taught her. When Leonard died in '83, Hugh put me on her Foreign Policy Advisory Committee and also on a Security Intelligence Committee of all the former heads of the British intelligence, security, you name it. Anyway, I was of no importance, but it was an extremely interesting perch from which to watch the last 10 years of the Cold War. I could tell you lots of stories about that. First thing that happened, we got on the committee, Thatcher was about to meet Gorbachev for the first time, and she asked for briefs on the Chinese economic reform so she could talk to him about them. Very interesting. I didn't particularly like her, except I completely by accident had lunch with her with just 3 of us. Others, I was a fly on the wall, the others were old friends, 2 days after she was kicked out. And she was, of course, she was deeply vulnerable and hurt. And she said things and exposed vulnerabilities in her personality, which she would never have done normally, even afterwards, let alone as Prime Minister. That was rather fascinating and even rather moving. You could intuit it was not exactly easy for a lower middle class woman to become head of the Tory party. When she became head of the Tory party, women were not allowed in the Tory club. They had to change the rules overnight. Lots of interesting moments. Sad ones too. I remember a very interesting lunch with Douglas Hurd, then the Foreign Secretary, around the Republican elections in spring 1990, talking for 3 hours about the implications of Ukrainian independence. You could talk to Douglas Hurd. He knew about history. Lots of expeditions to Spain, which I won't go into now. The other committee, certainly the most exciting seminar of my life, or conference of my life. The IRA decided to blow us up. The police cased the joint and didn't. Fairly enough, we've got the GOC in Northern Ireland, we've got the head of Special Branch, the whole bloody lot. The police checked out the location, didn't find anything. The little electrician, just before the meeting was supposed to begin, saw that the lectern was a bit wobbly. He didn't think anything nefarious was going on. He just thought one of the old generals or admirals might fall over. He picked it up and found a really nice IRA sandwich bomb underneath. I mean, one of the sadder elements of that is if we had all been blown up, no one would have noticed me, you know. I really would have been collateral damage. But anyway, I wasn't. We survived. My time on these committees, and indeed that whole period of my life, the only period when, I mean, I wrote 2 academic history books. My daughter, then my son was born. My wife was scudding around the world on her job, you know, and I was a full-scale teaching at LSE and all these committees. So it was very busy, but it was absolutely wonderful, you know, wonderful. And it came to an abrupt end. I left for Japan for 2 years leave of absence, the day before the Soviet Union collapsed, and it really was extraordinary. I watched television, of course, every day, and when I watched television, as always, before I left, as always, there were the red flags flying over the Kremlin. I turned on the television in Japan and thought I was going to die. Over the Kremlin were flying, you know, the flags of the monarchy. You know, I rang up my uncle in London, and he was so excited by this. He was lying on the floor, having drunk so much vodka that he was completely not in this world. Anyway, I will more or less stop there. Just to say, though, that when I got back from Japan, I never wanted to be involved in contemporary politics. And apart from this, I left that to my brother. During the perestroika years, I think that a historian could really contribute. Apart from anything else, you even had to explain to the political scientists what this strange flag, you know, Yeltsin's lot were flying. But the point is, Gorbachev brought back onto the agenda the great questions of late imperial Russian history, not least how to merge or to create a compromise between Russian authoritarian political principles on which the political system was founded and liberal and even liberal democratic ideas borrowed from the West. Marrying that is never simple, and it isn't just a question of wicked reactionaries, you know, in the Kremlin. It is also that, you know, the Soviet Union, like the old Russian Empire, was not a Western country. It was the biggest country on earth, a multi-ethnic empire, formed together and held together, like most polities, by 70 years of practical experience of Soviet living. It astonished me that Gorbachev and his entourage could be so naive in the way they introduced these principles without really understanding just what a bomb they were setting off underneath them. Look, the obvious comparison was with Alexander II's reforms. This is liberal reform. What is it? 7, 8 years after the death of Nicholas I and his very highly conservative regime, you've got a significant element of the Russian intelligentsia calling for not just the overthrow of the monarchy, but also of private property and marriage. A year or two at the same time, you've got a major revolution in Poland. You didn't need to be, very knowledgeable to understand that Gorbachev was going to be in trouble because the Soviet situation was far more vulnerable. In the 1860s, empire was the name of the game, and there wasn't a democracy on earth except the United States, which was busily tearing itself to bits in the Civil War. By the 1980s, democracy is the only game in town when it comes to legitimation. Empire is acceptable. The British have just crushed the Indian Mutiny. Empire is certainly not acceptable in the 1980s. It's anathema. And on top of that, if you were going to talk about zakonnost, you actually had a constitution which allowed the republics to secede. So it was an astonishing business. Anyway, what I did was turn my experience of the Cold War into my old fantasy of writing a history about the rise and fall of Russian and Soviet empire within a comparative study of empire. In other words, putting Russia, and to some extent the Soviet Union, in the centre of comparative imperial history, which it never been before. One of the reasons for that is purely autobiographical. I can't go into it now, but I married a wonderful Japanese woman who worked a 26-hour day in finance. For every reason, it was inevitable. I was going to be the parent on duty. So flitting off to the archives was not a good idea, and writing comparative history in London was a very good one. I don't regret it or resent it in the slightest. It was brilliant, but we were lucky to have that particular mix. And having finished that book, then the children had grown up, and I disappeared back into the archives and wrote, I defeated Napoleon, personally. Russia against Napoleon, the struggle for Europe. Then I rounded up all the work I'd done on late Imperial Russia, but by now the archives were open. I had German, and I had this work I'd done on empire to give me a sort of slightly different conceptual approach to the origins of the First World War. I completely did my eyes in the archives. They treated me wonderfully, but my eyes were beginning to go. And I was working like a dog, because I was working in the foreign ministry, military, archives, but also GARF. Great, but I couldn't see when I got back. So my eyes sort of recovered, but it was clear my last book I couldn't read manuscript. So I wrote my book about what it meant to be an emperor, which, if you're feeling pompous, is about structure against agency across the millennia. It's also just is great fun in your mid-60s, meeting all these strange and extraordinary new people and having adventures, learning about political systems such as the Abbasid early caliphate, the Ottomans. 3 chapters on Chinese history. I've become an absolute, whatever. My house is now full of portraits of Qing emperors, to my wife's horror. So it was just great fun. My wife was a bit nervous about all this, but I told her that falling in love with Chinese emperors was better at the age of 65 than falling in love with young women. So she sort of, calmed down and accepted it. And I was wonderfully lucky because I got this job for the last 10 years of my life. It is the job for which British academics die. It's the closest a British historian gets to heaven without dying. I was the only research professor of history by the time I finished in Cambridge University. Which is privileged. The irony is, because when I started, my dear friend David Washbrook had a job, and they couldn't have 2. They got me in on my totally pretense qualifications as a political scientist. And irony of ironies, the last Russianist to have this job was E.H. Carr. So in personal terms, actually, I've come to have a great respect for Carr as a historian of international relations. So whatever. Not a pleasant man, and I don't think a good historian of Russia. Fine expert on international relations. So, in personal terms, wonderful, happy story. Of course, when you look at the context, the total opposite is true. Everything we hoped for, those wonderful, for us, days in the 1990s, all the academic connections grew open. We could talk to our colleagues. Very nice man gave me €1 million to help young Russian history. In fact, more than $1.5 million. So we could do things for all these young people, all sorts of dreams. For them, not for us. And then, here we are going backwards again. Back to where we were all those years ago, and feeling guilty. For the first time in my life, I was a bit scared. Actually, early time on Thatcher, because there was all these scares going on within the Soviet Army General Staff and the Politburo about NATO exercises and war. And, I better not go into it. I had some rather interesting lunches with a senior former Soviet official who was a British spy. But I wasn't as scared then as I am now. The combination of maybe 250 years of Anglo predominance in the world under threat in a way that it certainly hasn't been from the Cold War, since the Cold War, with global warming coming up in the background. That is quite a happy inheritance. Ron and I and our generation are handing over to you lot. So on that happy note, I'll stop. Yeah.
Thank you very much.